In the summer of 1914, Europe stood at the height of its power. The great empires, Britain, France, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Russia, controlled vast territories, commanded massive armies, and believed themselves secure in a fragile balance of power. Trade flourished, industry boomed, and while tensions simmered beneath the surface, few believed that the peace that had lasted for decades was about to shatter. Then, on June 28, 1914, a single act of violence in Sarajevo set the world on a course from which there would be no turning back. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, should have been an isolated tragedy, a diplomatic crisis to be resolved through negotiations. Instead, it became the spark that ignited the most destructive war the world had ever seen. Over the next 37 days, a complex web of alliances, rivalries, and political miscalculations would push Europe toward war. Austria-Hungary, backed by Germany, sought to punish Serbia for the assassination. Russia, determined to protect its Slavic ally, mobilized its forces. Germany, fearing encirclement, made the fateful decision to strike first. France and Britain, hesitant at first, soon found themselves drawn into the conflict. By August 4, 1914, the world was at war. But how did this happen? How did a regional crisis in the Balkans spiral into a global catastrophe? Could war have been avoided? Or was Europe already on a path to destruction? This is the story of the July crisis of 1914, the 37 days that changed history. Could World War I have been prevented, or was it inevitable? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to The Shadows in the Past for more untold history. On the morning of June 28, 1914, Sarajevo was alive with anticipation. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, had arrived on what was supposed to be a routine visit to demonstrate imperial authority over Bosnia, a recently annexed province. But beneath the polite diplomatic formalities, the air was thick with tension. Serbian nationalists saw Austria's rule over Bosnia as an occupation, and a radical group known as the Black Hand had been plotting to strike back. Among them was Gavrilo Princip, a 19-year-old revolutionary, who, along with his co-conspirators, had positioned themselves along the Archduke's motorcade route, waiting for the right moment to change history. At 10:15 a.m., the first attempt to kill Franz Ferdinand was made. One of the assassins, Nedeljko Kabrinović, hurled a grenade at the Archduke's open car. But the device was poorly timed, bouncing off the vehicle before exploding under the car behind it, wounding several officers and bystanders. The motorcade sped away, and the assassin's carefully coordinated attack began to unravel. Police quickly descended on the area, and the remaining conspirators scattered, including Princip, who believed his opportunity had been lost. What happened next was a twist of fate so improbable that it seemed scripted by destiny. Despite the clear security threat, Franz Ferdinand insisted on continuing his visit, even after arriving at City Hall visibly shaken from the attack. Rather than leave the city immediately, he made a fateful decision. He would visit the wounded officers in the hospital. At 12:30 p.m., his driver mistakenly took a wrong turn onto Franz Josef Street, bringing the car to an unexpected stop, directly in front of Gavrilo Princip, who had given up on his mission and was standing outside a cafe. Seizing the moment, he stepped forward, raised his pistol, and fired 2 shots. One struck Franz Ferdinand in the neck. The other hit his wife, Sophie, in the abdomen. Within minutes, both were dead. As the news spread, the world was stunned. In Vienna, Emperor Franz Joseph, though publicly outraged, expressed little personal grief. He had long resented his nephew's political views. But within the Austro-Hungarian government, the assassination was seen as more than just a tragedy. It was an opportunity. For years, Serbia had been viewed as a destabilizing force, fueling nationalist sentiment among Austria's Slavic populations. Now, with Germany's backing, Austria-Hungary saw its chance to crush Serbia once and for all. But was this truly a Serbian conspiracy, or was Austria-Hungary looking for an excuse? And if war was coming, would it remain a regional conflict or spiral into something far greater? The first domino had fallen, but the world still had 37 days to stop the war before it began. In the next chapter, we uncover the fateful decisions made in Berlin, Vienna, and Moscow, decisions that would take the world from diplomatic crisis to total war. Once the wheels were in motion, there would be no stopping them. Did one man really start World War I, or was Europe already on the path to war? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to The Shadows in the Past for more untold history. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand had sent shockwaves through Vienna, but Austria-Hungary's initial response was not immediate war, nor even public outrage. Emperor Franz Joseph, weary and aging, was indifferent to his nephew's fate, while many within the government saw the assassination as an opportunity rather than a tragedy. For years, Serbia had been a persistent threat to the integrity of the empire, stirring nationalist sentiment among Slavic populations within Austria-Hungary's borders. Now, Vienna had a reason, perhaps even an excuse, to strike. But Austria-Hungary could not act alone. The empire had grown weak in recent years, struggling to maintain its vast and diverse territories. A war against Serbia risked drawing in Russia, Serbia's powerful Slavic ally. Austria's leaders knew that if they moved against Serbia, they would need the full backing of their closest and most powerful partner, Germany. On July 5, 1914, just 1 week after the assassination, Austria-Hungary's representatives travelled to Berlin to meet with Kaiser Wilhelm II. The German emperor, unpredictable and prone to impulsive decisions, listened as Austria's delegation laid out their case. Serbia had orchestrated the assassination, and war was necessary to restore Austria's honor. The question was whether Germany would support Austria if the conflict expanded beyond the Balkans. Wilhelm, eager to assert German power and convinced that Russia would hesitate to intervene, gave Austria-Hungary a blank check, a diplomatic term for unconditional support. Whatever Austria decided to do, Germany would stand by them, no matter the consequences. To Berlin, this was a calculated risk. Wilhelm and his generals believed that if war came, it had to come sooner rather than later. Russia was modernizing its military, and in a few years, Germany feared it would become too strong to contain. If war was inevitable, better now than later. With Germany's backing secured, Austria-Hungary now had a free hand to act against Serbia. But even with this assurance, Austria hesitated. Their military was unprepared for war, and the empire's leaders spent nearly 3 weeks deliberating how to frame their response. Instead of striking quickly, they drafted an ultimatum so severe that they knew Serbia could never fully accept it. On July 23, 1914, nearly a month after the assassination, Austria-Hungary formally presented Serbia with its ultimatum, a list of demands so intrusive that it effectively stripped Serbia of its sovereignty. Among the conditions was a requirement that Austrian officials be allowed to conduct investigations within Serbia's borders, something no independent nation could ever accept. The ultimatum was deliberately designed to be rejected, giving Austria a justification for war. Serbia's response, however, surprised the world. The Serbian government, recognizing the stakes, accepted nearly every demand except the one that would allow Austria to operate on Serbian soil. It was a calculated move, compliant enough to appear reasonable, but firm enough to maintain national dignity. The world waited to see how Vienna would react. On July 25th, Austria-Hungary rejected Serbia's reply outright, and within hours began preparing for war. Diplomats across Europe scrambled to contain the situation, but the crisis was rapidly slipping out of control. Russia, bound by its pan-Slavic commitments, began partial mobilization to support Serbia. sending a clear message that it would not stand by and watch Austria destroy its ally. What had begun as a regional crisis was now on the verge of becoming a European war. But the key players still believed they could control the escalation. A fatal miscalculation. The next move belonged to Germany, and in the coming days it would make a decision that would transform a regional conflict into a world war. Was Germany truly backing Austria, or was it using the crisis as an excuse to start the war on its own terms? Let me know in the comments. In the final days of the July crisis of 1914, the crisis that had begun with an assassination in Sarajevo had evolved into a full-scale diplomatic standoff. Austria-Hungary, emboldened by Germany's blank check, was now moving toward war with Serbia. But even as Vienna rejected Serbia's conciliatory response and ordered partial mobilization, the real decision-makers were no longer in Austria. They were in Berlin and St. Petersburg. Russia had watched Austria's actions with growing unease. Serbia was a Slavic ally, and Tsar Nicholas II knew that if Austria-Hungary attacked, Russia would be expected to intervene. But the Tsar hesitated. His empire had suffered humiliating defeats in the Russo-Japanese War, 1904-1905, and was still recovering from internal unrest. Russia was not fully prepared for war, and Nicholas was reluctant to make the first move. However, when Austria formally declared war on Serbia on July 28, 1914, the pressure became unbearable. Fearing that inaction would weaken Russia's standing in Europe, Nicholas ordered partial mobilization, placing his military on high alert. To Germany, this was an act of war in everything but name. Berlin had been closely monitoring Russian troop movements, and German intelligence reports suggested that full mobilization was inevitable. If Russia mobilized, it would set off a chain reaction. Germany would have to respond, which would pull in France, and once France was involved, Britain could not remain neutral for long. The German High Command believed they faced a simple choice: wait for their enemies to strike first or launch a preemptive war. On July 31, 1914, Germany issued an ultimatum to Russia: halt all mobilization immediately or face war. At the same time, a similar warning was sent to France, demanding that it declare neutrality in any potential conflict. Both nations ignored these demands. Tsar Nicholas, torn between his advisers and his family's ties to Kaiser Wilhelm, was unable to reverse course. In response, on August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. At this point, the German military activated its long-prepared Schlieffen Plan, a strategy designed to win a two-front war by swiftly defeating France before Russia could fully mobilize. The plan relied on speed, overwhelming force, and most crucially, a quick invasion of Belgium, whose flat terrain provided the fastest route to France. The problem: Belgium was a neutral country, and its sovereignty was guaranteed by Britain. On August 3rd, Germany declared war on France, and the following day, German troops crossed the Belgian border. It was the final domino. The British government, which had remained hesitant up to this point, now had its justification to act. At 11 p.m. on August 4th, Britain declared war on Germany. The war that no one had wanted, yet no one had prevented, had begun. What had started as a localized conflict in the Balkans had, in just 5 weeks, drawn in the world's greatest powers. Millions of soldiers would soon be marching to their deaths, and within months, battlefields across Europe would be soaked in blood. But no one, not the Kaiser, the Tsar, or the British Prime Minister, had any idea just how catastrophic the next 4 years would be. Did Germany's Schlieffen Plan make war inevitable? By August 1914, the 37-day countdown to war had reached its final moments. On the night of August 4th, Britain's declaration of war against Germany marked the moment that a regional conflict in the Balkans had transformed into a full-scale global catastrophe. The great powers of Europe were now locked into a war that, despite their meticulous planning, none of them truly understood. In Berlin, the reaction was a mixture of celebration and anxiety. Crowds cheered in the streets, convinced that Germany's military superiority would ensure a swift and decisive victory. The German High Command had placed its faith in the Schlieffen Plan, a carefully rehearsed strategy that aimed to crush France within 6 weeks before turning east to confront Russia. But the plan had one major flaw. It required Germany to invade neutral Belgium. Germany's assault on Belgium was not just a military maneuver, it was a political miscalculation that would reshape the war. The Germans had expected Belgium to offer little resistance. Instead, the Belgian army, vastly outnumbered and outgunned, put up an unexpectedly fierce fight. In cities like Liège and Namur, the Belgians used their network of fortresses and railways to delay the German advance, throwing off Germany's strict timeline for victory. But more crucially, the violation of Belgian neutrality had drawn Britain into the war. The British government had been divided over whether to intervene, but Germany's aggression gave them a clear justification. Within days, British expeditionary forces were landing in France, preparing to reinforce the retreating French army. What had once been an anticipated quick German victory now looked uncertain. At the same time, the Eastern Front was unraveling faster than Germany had anticipated. Russia had mobilized far more quickly than expected, launching an invasion of East Prussia before the German army had even completed its advance into France. Germany had assumed that Russia's vast size and lack of infrastructure would slow its mobilization, but the Russians struck early, forcing Germany to divert critical reinforcements from the Western Front. The Schlieffen Plan was already falling apart. Meanwhile, in Paris, panic spread as German troops pushed into Belgium and northeastern France. The French government, remembering its humiliating defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, prepared for the worst. Many officials fled the city, fearing a repeat of the German occupation of Paris from 4 decades earlier. But in their desperation, the French High Command made one final gamble: the Battle of the Marne. On September 6, 1914, just weeks after the war had begun, French and British forces launched a counter-offensive along the Marne River. The battle would become one of the most decisive moments of the war. The Germans, stretched thin from fighting on 2 fronts, were forced to halt their advance just miles from Paris. The dream of a quick victory was over. By September 1914, the war had settled into a stalemate. The trench systems that would define World War I were already being dug, stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border. What had started as a war of speed and maneuver had now turned into a war of attrition and endurance. The generals who had promised their nations victory by Christmas were now realizing the truth. This war would not be won in months, but in years. The battle lines had been drawn, but in just weeks both sides would realize that this was no ordinary war. It was the beginning of the modern battlefield. The horrors of trench warfare, gas attacks and industrialized killing were yet to come. How could this impasse have been avoided? The July crisis of 1914 was a diplomatic disaster unlike any other, a moment in history where a handful of decisions made in the corridors of power led the world into catastrophe. It began with an assassination on the streets of Sarajevo. It escalated through miscalculation, arrogance, and unchecked nationalism. And within just 37 days, it ended with the world's most powerful nations locked in a war that would claim over 20 million lives. Looking back, the question remains, was the First World War inevitable? Many argue that the war was the product of a fragile international system where rigid alliances, nationalist rivalries, and militarization had created a ticking time bomb. The great powers of Europe had spent decades preparing for war, building armies and stockpiling weapons under the belief that a future conflict would be swift and decisive. Yet, when war finally came, it was nothing like they had imagined. Others believe that war could have been avoided, if not for fatal miscalculations. Austria-Hungary, eager to crush Serbia, underestimated the consequences of its actions. Germany, convinced that a preemptive strike was necessary, set the entire continent on fire. Russia, determined to prove its strength, escalated tensions rather than diffusing them. Britain and France, hesitant at first, were ultimately pulled into a war they had hoped to avoid. Every decision, every ultimatum, every moment of hesitation and aggression made war more likely, until peace was no longer an option. But beyond its causes, the true lesson of the July crisis lies in its consequences. The war that began in 1914 destroyed empires, redrew borders, and reshaped the world. The Ottoman Empire collapsed. The Austro-Hungarian Empire ceased to exist. Germany, defeated and humiliated, would seek revenge in the decades to come. And the peace that followed, the Treaty of Versailles, would set the stage for an even greater conflict, World War II. The First World War was not just a war of soldiers and battles. It was a war of decisions. Decisions made by men in palaces and war rooms, by diplomats and emperors, by generals and politicians. And in those decisions we see a warning from history that wars are rarely started by a single event, but by a series of choices, a failure to see the bigger picture and the belief that violence can ever be controlled. Could the July crisis have ended differently? Could Europe have been spared the Great War? Or was the path to 1914 already written in the decades before? Let me know in the comments. And if you liked this video, you're going to love this one about the bloodiest day of World War I.